Our topic this evening is a fun one. We're going to look at some of the Bible's most villainous characters. We have done a lot of lectures where we deep dive into individual biblical characters, and some of these are more obscure than others. So Lazarus, who was Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, King David, James, the brother of Jesus, Pontius Pilate, John the Baptist. These are just some of the ones that we've already done. And I was thinking about doing some on, characters that are antagonists rather than the protagonists. And I thought, well, it might be good to do an overview and a survey first, and hopefully you'll enjoy that. The Bible, of course, is a library of books that is written over many centuries by different authors, writing in different languages with different perspectives and agendas even. They have different worldviews, they have different theologies, and biblical authors, far from speaking with one voice, often are actually at odds with one another, arguing against one another. And so within that collection, the many villains, obviously they're too numerous to treat in a single evening, even though our lectures tend to go on pretty long. They nevertheless have a wide variety. There are a whole potpourri of them. And they range from being, let's say, one-dimensional, cardboard cutout, black and white characters that are simply evil and there to make trouble for the protagonist, the prophet, or whoever. And then there are also, though, much more complex characters that have more understandable motivations that we might even be sympathetic to. And so I want to look at kind of the range of these in this overview tonight. Of course, the Bible's number one villain is the devil. And although he sort of leads the pack in terms of being the leader of all of the villains, as you might expect, the devil has fewer appearances in the Bible than might be expected. So the devil is referenced actually frequently in the Christian New Testament, but he only appears as a character very rarely. The main example in the Gospels is the story of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, a story that is placed in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke immediately after Jesus' baptism. Both of them are drawing upon likely a narrative that was part of the lost Q source. It's one of the very few narratives that is not simply sayings. There's actually something going on in terms of a little story within this temptation of Jesus narrative. So if we look at how that story makes its way into the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew's version, Jesus fasting, like I say, follows his baptism. And we read in Matthew chapter 4, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tested by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterward he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread.' But Jesus answered, 'It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God.' Then the devil took him up to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, 'If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone.' Jesus said to him, 'Again, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test.' And the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him. Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. So, like I say, this is a narrative story, one of the very few ones that seem to come from Q where there's a story attached to sayings. The devil is portrayed in his role as tempter, and he's being called the tempter in a synonym, and he offers your basic these sort of desires that human beings might be tempted with: material, substance, sustenance, goods, fame, and then worldly power. And in each case, Jesus rejects the temptation by quoting Scripture, and that's very deliberate. It's showing the value of Scripture to keep you on the right path, to help you avoid these kind of worldly concerns, according to how the Q author believed, rendering the devil then powerless to tempt him. So Jesus calls the devil Satan, which had already by this time in the first century of the Christian era developed into a proper name. And so pretty much everywhere where we hear the word Satan in the New Testament, it has become the name of the devil. The character of the Satan, so the word from the Hebrew means the accuser, and it is not a noun, it is a title, makes an appearance in the book of Job among the sons of El, the heavenly beings, it's sometimes translated, where the accuser, the Satan, serves as a villain and an antagonist in the prologue of the book of Job. And so we read at the beginning of the book of Job, one day the heavenly beings, that is, the sons of El, the sons of God, came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, the Satan, also came among them. The Lord said to the accuser, "Where have you come from?" And the accuser answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and walking from up and down on it." So God asks the Satan if he has considered Job, who God says is really the most upright and blameless man on earth. God's really pleased with how Job is doing. Satan, though, argues that Job is really only righteous. He only reveres God because God has blessed him so much. He's also one of the richest men on earth and very prosperous, has a wonderful family and so on. And so he says if Job were to lose all of his possessions and his family, he would change his tune. And so the Lord doesn't think so, but he says to the accuser, "Very well, all that he has is in your power, only do not stretch out your hand against him." So the accuser went out from the presence of the Lord. So in this depiction, the character of the Satan is part of God's court. He's one of the heavenly beings, and he has an official function within that court as the accuser. He's going around and essentially functioning as a district attorney or something. He is leading a loyal opposition, essentially. And even after he destroys all Job's possessions, he then comes back and is given permission to also destroy Job's health. And nevertheless, Job does not actually give in. So while the Satan is ultimately then proved wrong, because despite intolerable suffering, Job does not, give in and give up and curse God. The Satan, nevertheless, in this prologue to the book of Job, primarily seems to be doing his job. There's not really even any indication in the text that he is reveling in Job's suffering. But this sense of the character from the book of Job varies considerably from how the character of Satan or how the understanding of Satan has evolved by New Testament times, where Satan is equated with a much more cosmic and much more powerful devil that is essentially embodying evil itself. So the development of that idea, a cosmic devil, someone more akin, for example, to the devil in Zoroastrianism, the dualist god of evil in the Persian religion, the Persian world religion, that occurred in the Second Temple period. And as we've seen in so many lectures, it's especially present in apocalyptic writings, most of which did not make it in to the canon. And so almost the entire period between the Testaments, or when the last Old Testament books were written and then the New Testament books are written, there is a vast amount of Jewish writing that is called apocalyptic, including the Book of Enoch, which does not make it into almost anybody's canon of Scripture. Just a handful of them, like the Book of Daniel, one of the last Old Testament books to be written, made it in, and one Apocalypse, of course, made it into the New Testament as well, the Revelation of John. So, and indeed, it's in that book that the devil has his other major appearance in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John of Patmos, John the Revelator. So in that book, John the Revelator has a vision of the devil as a great red dragon. So he says in his vision, a great portent appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in the birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars in heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to deliver a child so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule the nations with a scepter of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that she can be nourished there for 1,260 days. So one of the ideas of apocalypticists is that they are really believing that the end times are being lived right at the present, and there's only a certain number of days left here before the world will literally end, at least in the vision of John of Patmos. From his day. So in other words, that did not happen. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So this imagery in Revelation connects previously unrelated biblical images. So one is the image, of this dragon, this chaos monster called, for example, in the Old Testament, Leviathan or Behemoth. And this is the chaos monster from Middle Eastern mythology, originally part of Middle Eastern creation myths like the Baal cycle, where Baal kills the chaos monster in order to create the world. So that is a characteristic of Baal that is absorbed into Yahweh, into the God of Israel. And so there are remnants of this story in the Old Testament. And so that's one of the components of this cosmic devil that is being combined in Revelation. Another is that old serpent, which is to say the serpent from the Garden of Eden story in Genesis. And then, of course, the Satan, who is a character from God's court that we just read about in the book of Job. All of those are mashed together now to create a cosmic devil, which has been talked about an awful lot in other apocalyptic books, but you can see it in the Bible here in Revelation. So after Jesus' birth, the archangel Michael cast Satan down from heaven so that he can no longer visit God's court the way that he had been doing in the story in the book of Job. So according to Revelation, these events enraged the devil, making him an enemy of Christians. So we read, "Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, which are those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus," that is to say, the Christians in the first century who were feeling really beleaguered, like the communities in Asia Minor to which John the Revelator is writing these words, which he hopes are reassuring that they will soon be vindicated when a literal end of the world happens that will result in the defeat of evil. So in the book of Revelation's visions, like I say, the devil most resembles this chaos monster. It's this giant dragon with multi-heads who is simply raging in anger. And so the idea that we have now in the present, the devil is a sympathetic character often. There's TV shows and graphic novels and things like that about the character of the devil. A lot of this is developed since the great English epic Paradise Lost, written by Milton, where Milton describes a character who says he prefers to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So it's more of a sympathetic character, or a character whose motivations you understand, than this chaos beast in Revelation. So as we also saw here, that the reference in Revelation and other passages of the New Testament illustrate that early Christians had already begun to reinterpret the character of the serpent from the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. They'd come to see that serpent as the devil. But if we were instead to examine just the original author of that section of Genesis, they would have had no such intention. They were not imagining the character of the serpent to be a cosmic devil or anything like that. Because when this text was written, probably at the very end of the First Temple period, this is before the idea of a cosmic devil has been introduced into Judaism. And so let's look at it as a different, discrete villain in the Bible, the serpent in Eden. So the Eden story is associated with the Yahwist author, and that's from the documentary hypothesis of who wrote the Torah, but it would also be true for a supplementary hypothesis where essentially it's not the priestly author, it's an earlier writer. The Yahwist is what we would call that writer, whose narratives have a more courtly rather than priestly flavor, and who envisions God as more fleshy, as more anthropomorphic than the priestly writer of the Torah does. And so in that story, the serpent of Eden is described rather simply and matter-of-factly as, a serpent. And so we read in Genesis chapter 3, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made." So it's a wild animal. It's one of the many, in other words, non-domesticated animals that God made, the serpent. And at the end of the story of Eden, there is an etiological explanation for why serpents don't have legs. So God punishes man and woman and the serpent for disobedience. And so as part of the punishment for the serpent's role in Eden, he doesn't have legs anymore, and that's an etiological myth. So people ask, well, why don't snakes have arms and legs? And the answer is because God punished them so they wouldn't. So it wouldn't make any sense to punish all serpents if it was just Satan who was merely appearing as a serpent in the story. And again, if Satan had been this embodied character of evil, or if the devil had been inhabiting the serpent, one would think that that character would recur. The very next chapter is the story of Cain and Abel, and it's not like the devil appears to Cain and tempts him to commit the first murder. That's not what happens in the story at all, as we'll see when we look at Cain and Abel's story. We do hear that the serpent is crafty, and it does, stir up trouble. So we read in the Eden story, the serpent said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, "You shall not eat the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die." But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the serpent is doing this temptation, he's actually not saying anything really about, it's not seductive in a way, but rather he's actually sharing valid information. It turns out that the fruit does give knowledge of good and evil, which is described even by God as being a godlike ability. And although Eve is actually paraphrasing what God had told Adam about dying, God had actually said that on the day that you eat of it, you will die. And they don't actually immediately die when they eat it. Nevertheless, if we understand this, where it exists elsewhere in the understanding of the time that a day is 1,000 years unto the Lord, they do have about 1,000-year lifespan at this point. And so it might mean that, yes, on that day, as far as the Lord is concerned, you will die. But nevertheless, eating it, while it directly gave them the ability to know good from evil, it only indirectly brought mortality upon the woman and the man because of their exile from Eden, which resulted in their inability to eat from the other tree, the tree of life that was in the garden, that hadn't been forbidden. So, before we leave the devil behind, I want to point out one more appearance in the New Testament of the devil. So, there's an interesting point of minor agreement between Luke and John. Normally, Luke and Matthew will agree against each other when they're sharing a Q document, or they'll agree with something that Mark has written because they're using Mark as a source. John is has a different history to it and is a different witness and is often quite different from the other three Gospels. But this is a place where Luke and John have an agreement. And so both of them state that during the Last Supper, at the end of Jesus' ministry, one of the apostles, Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, Satan enters him in a kind of demonic possession, or it doesn't say that, but anyway, it says enters as opposed to inspires him to do something wrong. So this overlap brings us to one of the Bible's other very prominent villains, Jesus' betrayer, Judas Iscariot. So that the historical Jesus was betrayed is attested by multiple independent witnesses, including Paul, which is unusual. So Paul is the earliest Christian whose writings survive, as we know, and he rarely describes events in Jesus' life, but when he's talking about the practice of the Eucharist, the practice of communion, he puts a setting at that time of the Last Supper, and he mentions, this is Paul writing to the Corinthians, "I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, on the night he was handed over, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" So Paul's point here is actually to actually explain to the Corinthians the idea behind and how communion or the Eucharist is to be practiced with the breaking of bread and the sharing of the cup. But he almost incidentally says, well, this is the night when he was betrayed. So does seem to be an event that Paul is well aware of, and so early Christians have remembered in this first decades after Jesus' crucifixion. Although Paul doesn't name Jesus' betrayer by name, all 4 of the canonical Gospels do. So they call him Judas Iscariot, and they list him as one of the 12 apostles. So the name Judas is the Greek rendering of the Hebrew name Judah. So Judah is one of the 12 sons of Israel and one of the 12 tribes of Israel in the book of Genesis and after. And so it's a very common name at the time in among the Jewish people, and it's also has continued to be, and it was also a common name in the New Testament. The surname Iscariot, which most likely means man from Kerioth, man from the town of Kerioth, the town to south of Judea, that's simply used to differentiate him from the many other Judases, Judas, or Jude. That's all the same name. They talk about Jude. That's the same name that exists in the New Testament. So Judas Iscariot appears a few times actually in Mark, the earliest Gospels. It's twice in terms of an overall story. He first appears in the list of the 12 apostles at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, which concludes, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So it's not really subtle foreshadowing what's going to happen. He's listed as the betrayer right at the beginning. And then he is next in Mark's account of the betrayal overall. So immediately after an episode where, in the Gospel of Mark anyway, an unnamed woman anoints Jesus with a precious perfume and ointment in the town of Bethany, which is right next to Jerusalem, we read then, Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests in Jerusalem, to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So Judas, watched for an opportunity to hand him over to, which is also how Paul calls this event. So in this first account, Mark's account, Judas is acting spontaneously. And so though when he goes to the priests and is promised money afterwards, it isn't clear that was his motivation. He first seeks to betray him, and then it's only afterwards that the priests offer him money. This is changed in Matthew's account, where money is more clearly made Judas' motivation. So we read in Matthew 26, his version of this story, then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So again, the motivation now in Matthew is very clearly for money. By contrast, as we already said, in Luke and John, the priests are already looking for a traitor, and then Satan enters Judas. So he has this demonic motivation on top of also getting paid money. So the story of the anointing at Bethany also occurs in the Gospel of John. It's in all the Gospels. The woman who was unnamed in Mark is identified as Mary of Bethany, who is the sister of Martha, and also in the Gospel of John, she is the sister of Lazarus. So this version of the story in Mark, there were just unnamed disciples who objected that a woman shouldn't be anointing Jesus' feet like this. But in the Gospel of John, those objections are connected with Judas. So we read in the story, one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Judas says, Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. The author of John, though, who is keen, more keen than the other gospel writers to portray Judas as kind of a black and white cardboard cutout villain, then immediately adds, he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself up to what was put into it. So thus in the portrayal in the Gospel of John, Judas has the additional role in the group of Jesus' disciples as the keeper of the money bag. So he's kind of like the group treasurer, as people are all giving all to the poor, giving all their property to the poor, and handing it out as any have need. But it also identifies him as a thief. So he's an embezzler, according to the Gospel of John. I want to talk about Judas and anti-Semitism. So being motivated by money is, of course, an anti-Semitic trope. And so this fact, coupled with Judas' name, so Judas has the same root name essentially for Jew, since the word Jew comes from Judean, which comes from Judahite, Judahite, which is to say person from the tribe of Judah, so it's the same name. That's led to speculation that, for example, Judas is simply written as a literary creation to essentially convey an anti-Semitic story. And so let's pause on that. So while the story of Judas, it's inarguable, has sometimes led Christians, and often, unfortunately, led Christians since it was written, to be anti-Semitic. So there's a long history of Christian anti-Semitism, from the first century on into the present day. And even this painting, from 1909, I think, is sort of really making Judas hero with a really prominent nose, whereas the paintings of Jesus never seem to do that, even though they're both Jewish. Nevertheless, the figure's name, the historical figure's name, is multiply attested in the tradition, and so it's not itself likely an invention. So there probably was a betrayer who historically is named Judas. Many other figures in the New Testament are named Judah, including, for example, Jude, the brother of Jesus, and in the Gospel of Luke, Luke lists another apostle, Judas, the son of James, and there's other Judases too. And so Judas isn't taken as a bad name necessarily at first, and this name for the betrayer, Judas Iscariot, is really early and multiply attested in the traditions. That said, once it's identified, then yes, Christians can have used it to make anti-Semitic claims later. Anyway, let's look at more accounts about Judas. So in Mark's account, after the Last Supper, as Jesus and the disciples are praying in private at night in Gethsemane near Jerusalem, he tells them, Jesus says, "The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." And just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared, and with him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them: "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi, teacher," and then kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. So the disciples flee as Jesus is taken to trial and then executed. And in Mark's gospel anyway, we don't hear anything more of Judas' fate after he betrays Jesus with a kiss. So presumably uncomfortable with seeing Judas go unpunished, when he's reading about that in his source, Mark, Matthew tells an additional story. He gives Judas an epilogue. So we read in Matthew chapter 27, "When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, He was seized with remorse, and he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left, and then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, it's against the law to put this into the treasury since it is blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners, and that is why that field has been called the field of blood to this day. So, a fate for Judas as described in the Gospel of Matthew. Interestingly, the author of Luke and Acts, who is also working for Mark, is also interested in telling Judas' fate, and they're aware of an association that Judas' fate has with this field of blood outside of Jerusalem. But interestingly, the details given in Acts chapter 1 directly contradict Matthew's version of Judas' fate. So we read in the book of Acts, in those days Peter stood up among the believers, a group numbering about 120. So this is the entire early Christian community, as portrayed anyway in the book of Acts right after the resurrection. Peter said, brothers and sisters, the scripture had to be fulfilled in which the Holy Spirit spoke long ago through David. And what he means here is Psalm 69, which he's interpreting as a messianic scripture. So concerning Judas, who had served as guide for those who arrested Jesus. Judas was one of our number and shared in our ministry. With the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field, and there he fell headlong. His body burst open, and all of his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, and so they called that field in their language Akeldama, that is, the field of blood. So it's impossible to have both thrown the money back to the priests and also to use it to buy a field. So, a lot of times people would like to believe that the Bible is fully inerrant, that it's a literal history book, that it doesn't contain any contradictions. This is an inarguable contradiction. That just shows that literalistic impression is clearly can't be held. And history also shows, as we show, that so much less is historical than people imagine. But anyway, this is clearly that one particular case isn't the case. So anyway, whatever way Judas died, it's as important a figure as he was, really turns out, I think, in the Gospels that he's not really well drawn out as a character. Certainly in Mark, the earliest of the Gospels, even his motivations are kind of vague and we don't hear much what happens to him. He suffers remorse in Matthew, but he doesn't seem to suffer remorse in Luke or Acts. And then the portrayal that we have that's more drawn out in the Gospel of John, he comes off as especially venal. He's a thief, among other things that he's doing. Another villain of the New Testament is King Herod the Great, especially famous in the New Testament account in terms of villainy for his massacre of the innocents, all of the boy children in the area of Bethlehem. We've had an entire lecture on who was Herod the Great, so I'll just refer you to that, and we won't go into him here. We talked about how historians dismiss the historicity of this event, but it's certainly a villainous as Herod is a character in the Bible. Actually, there's lots of Herods in the Bible, and they're all pretty villainous. One of these is Herod's granddaughter, Herodias. And so Herodias is the daughter of Herod the Great's son. He has many sons, but one of his sons, Aristobulus IV. So Herodias is Aristobulus' daughter. She is originally married to her half-uncle, another son of Herod the Great, a guy who historians call Herod II. But after her grandfather's death, she divorced her first uncle husband to marry his half-brother, another son of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, who was also her half-uncle. So she is definitely passing around, marrying fairly closely within this family. So Herod Antipas, during the lifetime of John the Baptist and Jesus, during their ministries, he was a minor ruler. He was the tetrarch, which means ruler over a fourth, and he was in charge specifically of Galilee and the Perea during the ministries of John the Baptist and Jesus. According to the Gospel of Mark, John the Baptist objected to all of this crazy marrying and divorcing and remarrying within the family that Herodias was doing, which ultimately led Herodias to have him executed. So we read in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, Herod, and by which the Bible never explains which Herod it's talking about, so you have to look it up. But anyway, Herod Antipas himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, so this would be Herod II's wife, whom he married. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." So Herodias nursed a grudge against John the Baptist and wanted to kill him. But she was not able to have him killed because Herod Antipas, her husband, feared and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and a holy man. And when Herod heard John preaching, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. So that's pretty dangerous for Herodias, who, if John is constantly saying it's wrong for you to be married to your niece like this, she might get divorced from him or put away and lose her power. So finally, the opportune time came. On Herod Antipas' birthday, he gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders, all the leading men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king, it says, the tetrarch actually, Herod Antipas, said to the girl, "Ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you." He promised her with an oath, "Whatever you ask, I will give you up to half my kingdom, up to half my tetrarchy." So she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask for?" And her mother is ready, right? Herodias is ready. "The head of John the Baptist," she answered. At once the girl hurried into the king, the tetrarch, with the request, "I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Herod Antipas, the tetrarch, was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and because his dinner guests were all there, he didn't want to refuse her, so he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in prison, and brought back his head on a platter. So let's do a villain assessment here of Herodias. So foolish rulers granting boons, people swearing an oath that they're going to give somebody who's a favorite of theirs a boon. They're a common theme in lots of courtly stories. There's the famous myth from Greek mythology where Helios, the sun god, grants his mortal son, Phaethon, any wish. And Phaethon says he wants to be able to drive the chariot of the sun, which no mortal is able to do, and it ends in Phaethon's death and disaster in general. But he has to do it because he made that oath. So if we think of that, that's a kind of an opportunity for Herodias. So beginning with Herod the Great, who himself bribed the Roman Senate to make him king of Judea in the first place. His family had simply been a noble family from Idumea before that. The Herodian dynasty, all of its members continually intrigued for power or even just to stay alive. They were often in Rome arguing to the Senate that they should be given a tetrarchy or kingship over this or that land, and the dynasty ended up ultimately being placed by the Romans in realms that are completely outside of the Holy Land in the last instance. And in that game of power politics, obviously Herodias played it well and was able to take this dangerous prophet who was arguing that she should be put away by her uncle husband. She was able to win against him. Among courtly narratives and villains in the Bible who seek to use their influence with the ruler the way Herodias did with her uncle husband in order to achieve their foul ends, there's few who hold a candle to the character of Haman in the book of Esther. So Haman is described as the vizier or the prime minister. He's the chief of all of the nobility, the noble who serve under the Persian king who's called Ahasuerus. This likely means King Xerxes, the Persian Shahanshah Xerxes, and a lot of translations just say Xerxes. Haman became absolutely incensed with another courtier, a wise man named Mordecai. And Mordecai is a prominent Jew who refuses to bow to Haman. So we read in Esther chapter 3, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Why should I just kill this guy off? Instead, Haman looked forward to destroying all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, so throughout this vast world empire of Persia. So slyly, like a grim worm-tongue kind of guy, Haman whispers his plan to the king. Haman says to Xerxes, "There's a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So he's on the one hand talking about a threat, although he doesn't name the threat, so it's a vague threat. Who are these people? But he's also planning, a bribe or two. He's going to actually pay to have this thing happen. He's an incredibly rich administrator. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and he gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, to the enemy of the Jews. And the king of Persia, Xerxes, says, "Keep the money," he says to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." So he's so pleased with this offer to actually pay the treasury in order to protect the king's interests that he says, "You know what, you don't even have to pay me. Just go ahead and you take care of it." So things are looking bad for all of the Jews in Persia at this point in the book of Esther. But Mordecai also has an ace up his sleeve. It turns out that one of Xerxes' wives, and fortunately it's actually the most beautiful one of his wives, is a woman named Esther who is also a Jew. So Esther gets Xerxes to make the same exact promise that Herodias' daughter got from Herod Antipas, the tetrarch. So when Xerxes saw Esther, she was just in this case not dancing, but just being beautiful in the court, standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and he held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. It's a very suggestive gesture. Then the king asks, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." So Esther doesn't want to say immediately what she's going to ask for. Instead, she says she's going to throw a royal banquet in the king's honor, and she also specifically wants to invite Haman to it. Haman's excited about this. He doesn't make the connection that Esther is Jewish, and he thinks he's going to be really honored by this. And he goes through, there's a bunch of more episodes of him being greedy and getting his comeuppance. But finally, the king and Haman, we read in chapter 7, went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day of the banquet, the king again asked Queen Esther, "What is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." So the queen then says, "If I have found favor with you, Majesty, and if it please you, grant me my life. This is my petition. Spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." So if we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. But the fact is, my people they're also going to be killed. It's not just put into slavery, so this is why I'm making this request. So the king is astonished. He asks Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" And Esther says, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." And so with Haman's plot uncovered, the emperor Xerxes, he sides with his queen. He has Haman the vizier impaled on a 50-cubit pole. And then to add it all on top of it, he issues an edict of toleration for the Jews empire-wide. They're going to be able to have their own rights and customs and laws and not be discriminated against. So let's do a villain assessment for Haman. So Haman is playing this high-stakes game of courtly politics, and at a certain point he has risen all the way up to be the chief of all of the courtiers, in the prime minister, the vizier. But he is motivated primarily by vanity, so he just has a insatiable desire for honors. And when his vanity is slighted just a little bit by this other courtier, he has just a crazy disproportionate overreaction. And that overreaction to Mordecai obviously leads him to misplay his hand and results in his own execution. Not a great villain in that way. Not effective anyway. So not very ambiguous. So a much more ambiguous villain is the account of the first murderer in Genesis that we talked about. I mentioned how the serpent does not appear in the story, tempting Cain to kill his brother. So, like I say, it's immediately following the expulsion of the Adam and Eve from Eden story. And again, it's coming from this Yahweh source, the J source. So we read in chapter 4 of Genesis, the man, Adam, knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, "I have produced a man with the help of the Lord." Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. So both seem to be good kids here, the first two boys, as they are growing up, getting jobs, and making offerings to the Lord for the blessings that they've received. So far, so good. But then we read, the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering from the flocks, but for Cain and his agricultural plant offering, he had no regard. So God has no time for salad here. So don't make friends with salad, as they say. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." So this is good advice, but Cain does not take this advice. Instead, Cain says to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were out in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And then in one of the most quoted lines of the Bible, he says, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." So the Lord punishes Cain. He sends him to exile. He makes him a fugitive and a wanderer. Cain says it's more than he can bear, and that everybody's going to kill him. So the Lord says, "No, not so. You're not to be killed." And he puts a mark on him so that people know not to kill him. And it is not clear what that is meant to be. There is no consensus on it. But unfortunately, in the prism of early modern Protestantism, especially in the Americas, through the prism in the 18th and 19th century of racialized slavery, there was a false equation with the mark with being dark-skinned. So there's no basis for that in the Bible, but that is how the Bible was misinterpreted to justify racialized slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's not clear, frankly, in that story why the Lord rejected Cain's offering, but it does seem clear that the first murder was motivated by anger and jealousy, somebody not getting what he was seeing somebody else was getting. And so, although cursed to wander, what's interesting is in the very next verses of Genesis, Cain and his family build a city, the first city to be mentioned. So they name the city Enoch, which is the name of their son. This is a different Enoch that is a descendant of Cain's brother Seth and an ancestor of Noah. At least it's a different one as the Bible's now compiled. And the descendants of Cain then, from their city, invent all aspects of civilization, including things like bronze and iron tools and musical instruments. So let's look at another character, Moses' great antagonist, the Pharaoh of the Exodus story, who is an even more complex biblical villain. The Pharaoh has inherited a problem. Generations after being invited to live in Egypt, Hebrew people have multiplied and have become more numerous and powerful, it says anyway in Exodus, than the Egyptians. And so Pharaoh's response initially is to increase taxes and ultimately enslave all of them. And when that still is not dealing with the danger of their numbers, he orders the Hebrew midwives to kill all of the male children born to Israelite women. This is a command that they largely circumvent as they trick Pharaoh out of that, and also certainly in the case of Moses, he's put on the water of the Nile in a basket to save his life. So when Moses grows up and afterwards leaves Egypt and comes back, God calls him to be his prophet in order to answer the Israelites' prayers and bring them out of Egypt. But when Moses comes before Pharaoh, Moses initially really only asks for leave time so that the Hebrews can go celebrate a festival of their God in the wilderness. I think that Pharaoh doesn't necessarily trust or believe him, and Moses doesn't really intend to come back if he were to get this to happen. Pharaoh is not used to taking orders, and he is unwilling to let his enslaved population free. On the one hand, the population of the Hebrews is very dangerous. On the other hand, it's a source of amazing wealth. Eventually, the Lord brings 9 plagues on Egypt to show the Lord's power. But each time, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And indeed, the text often reads, "The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart," implying that the king of Egypt was being used by the Lord. And so the Pharaoh of the Exodus story as a villain is proud and stubborn, and he refuses really to relent up until the very end when his army chases the Israelites into the Red Sea. But on the other hand, as we do an assessment of him as a villain, Was the Lord kind of putting his thumb on the scale by hardening Pharaoh's heart all the way along? That sort of seems to fit into an Old Testament worldview where God uses foreigners as agents to chastise the Israelites. And that's certainly one of the main themes of the books that follow the Torah in the Old Testament, follow the 5 books of Moses, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which historians refer to as the Deuteronomic histories. These are written kind of together from the same school, and they share a worldview. And part of that is when the Israelites, forget Yahweh and they begin to worship multiple gods, when they revert to paganism, then God will use foreign peoples like the Amalekites or the Philistines to chasten them. In the book of Judges, this happens especially where the foreigners are able to come and conquer the Israelites temporarily. Then God turns out to raising up a judge, and when that happens, the people remember Yahweh as their God, and they're able to kick the Philistines out until the next generation, when the same cycle repeats. Like I say, the editors of the Deuteronomic school have this one big idea, and the question is then, do these foreigners, these villains that we have in the Bible, do they actually exercise their own free will? Nevertheless, because this is the attitude of the Deuteronomists, they also frequently put the blame for the problem of reverting to paganism on foreigners, and especially foreign women. And so one of the big enemies, or one of the big villains of the Bible, is Jezebel. Jezebel is a great exemplar of this theme. So she's the antagonist of the prophet Elijah in the book of Kings. So King Ahab of Israel marries a Phoenician princess, Jezebel. So Jezebel is a Phoenician princess, and she marries the king of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, King Ahab. So the author of the book of Kings blames Jezebel for bringing the worship of her god Baal to Samaria, the capital city of the northern kingdom, and for causing Baal's cult and priests and prophets to receive royal patronage, which also causes the worship of Yahweh to decline. So Jezebel is introduced in the 16th chapter of the first book of Kings, where the author is describing the development of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel under the Omri dynasty. So in the 38th year of King Asa of Judah, of the king of the southern kingdom, Ahab, son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. Ahab, son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria, his capital city, 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him, and as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nahab, who was the supposed founder of the northern kingdom, Ahab took as his wife Jezebel, daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, the temple that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made a sacred pole, an Asherah tree. Ahab did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than had all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his day, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and he set its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Joshua of Nun. So this account in Kings links Jezebel with the supposed reintroduction of paganism to Israel. So Ahab builds an altar to Baal and a temple in his capital city, Samaria, along with a pole, a sacred tree, associated with the worship of the goddess Asherah, the consort of El, also as El and Yahweh became the same, the consort of Yahweh. In addition, during a ceremony where the ancient city of Jericho, which was destroyed by Joshua according to the book of Joshua, when it is refounded, Hail of Bethel offers his firstborn son and another son as a human sacrifice. So this worst of Canaanite customs where the firstborn of every womb is mine, saith the Lord. The whole idea of this human sacrifice, which was part of Canaanite religion and continued also in Carthage. So the northern kingdom of Israel, as we know, was larger and more important than its southern rival Judah. So it's effectively 10 of the 12 tribes, and Judah is like 2 of the tribes. It's a little more complicated than that, but anyway, it's a lot more important and more developed also, not just in the Bible, but also according to the archaeological evidence of this time. King Ahab, the son of Omri, like we see, rules from his capital city, Samaria, which becomes ultimately an alternate name for the northern kingdom. So later we call this area, the northern kingdom, Samaria, and this becomes the land of the Samaritans, one of the heirs of Israel, as we talked about in our lecture, Who Were the Samaritans? So King Ahab makes an important marriage alliance with the wealthy Phoenicians. So we hear the Bible calls the Phoenicians, the Phoenician is the Greek name for this, it calls them Sidonians. A lot of these peoples, it's like when we talk about the Greeks, the Greek word for Greeks is Hellenes, right? And then there are, even in Homer, they're called the Danaans. It's the Romans who called them the Greeks because that's their communal name for them. So Sidonian here doesn't mean she's from Sidon, she's actually from Tyre. But Sidonian is just a biblical word for Phoenician. So Tyre was a very wealthy Phoenician city-state built on highly defensible group of islands off the coast of Phoenicia, off the coast of Lebanon now. Tyre still exists, but Tyre is now connected because you may recall famously when Alexander the Great is conquering this whole area, he actually builds what is it called? A bridgehead. I'm trying to think of this word for this. Anyway, he builds a ramp essentially through the water to it and makes it a peninsula, which it is today. So Tyre had grown wealthy and powerful through seafaring and trading, and indeed beginning in the 11th century, Phoenician city-states had developed a trading network all across the Mediterranean Sea, ultimately becoming the great kind of rivals of the Greeks, who are more in the Black Sea and the northern Mediterranean, and the Phoenicians also made their way out into the Atlantic even. By their height in the 9th century, they'd founded a number of colonies across that territory, including Carthage, that ended up being a great center of a Western Mediterranean empire, the great rival of Rome during its development. So Carthage was a colony of Tyre. And in fact, according to ancient historians anyway, this is a little bit of mythology, there are, as they're tracing kind of the royal house of Tyre, they are intermarried here, where we can see this Ethbal, who we mentioned in the book of Kings, whose daughter is Jezebel, who marries Ahab. We can see how Ethbal's line, therefore, gets married into the kings of Israel. So Ahab is the son of Omri, the dynasty of Omri, and their sons go on to rule after Ahab. And then their daughter, Athaliah, marries the king of Judah, and their descendants are the kings of Judah there. But if we go the other way and we look at the kings of Tyre, so Baal-ezer, and then Matan, and then Pumayatan. Pumayatan's sister is Dido, the founder of Carthage, and so and Pumayatan here is the name Pygmalion, which it's a different Pygmalion than the famous Pygmalion of Greek mythology, but this is a Greek version of a Phoenician name. And so anyway, you can see how Jezebel and her family are really important, and indeed important as the house that founds Carthage, at least in mytho-history. So the account in Kings indicates that Jezebel in particular is the royal patron of all of the prophets of Baal and Asherah when Elijah is challenging them to a holy duel. So we read that King Ahab, Jezebel's husband, went to meet Elijah, and when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is it you, troubler of Israel?" Elijah answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, the Omri dynasty, has, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore have all Israel assemble for me at Mount Carmel with 450 priests of Baal and 400 prophets of Baal, and 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So the patron here, the royal patron of these prophets of Baal and Asherah is Jezebel. So we've seen before when we looked at our Baal lecture, we looked at this episode in greater length, Elijah defeats them by calling fire down from heaven, and after he wins the sacrificial duel, he calls upon the mob to execute all of those hundreds of prophets of Baal and Asherah. So the killing of all of her prophets angers the queen. So we read in chapter 19 that Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all of the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." So she swears she's going to burn up Elijah the same way he burned up her prophets, and if not, may she die. So then Elijah is very afraid, and he got up and he fled for his life, and he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. So Elijah flees the kingdom of Israel and goes to the southern kingdom. His flight continues. He ultimately ends up at Mount Horeb in the Sinai Peninsula, and that prevents the queen from following through on her oath to kill him, but she at least gets rid of him. With Elijah in exile, Jezebel continues to exert a nefarious influence on her husband. So for example, King Ahab, we read, wants to purchase the vineyard next door to his palace in Samaria, but the owner of it refuses to sell because it's his ancestral land and he doesn't want to give it up. So Ahab then lay down on his bed and turned his face away, and he would not eat. And his wife Jezebel came to him and said, "Why are you so depressed that you will not eat?" And he said to her, "Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite, and I said to him, 'Give me your vineyard for money, or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard for it.' But he answered, 'I will not give you my vineyard.'" So his wife Jezebel said to him, "Do you now govern Israel? Get up, eat some food, be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, and she sealed them with his seal, and she sent the letters to the elders and the nobles who lived with Naboth in his city. She wrote them letters saying, "Proclaim a fast, and seat Naboth at the head of the assembly. Seat 2 scoundrels opposite him, and have them bring a charge against him, saying, 'You have cursed God and the king.' And then take him out and stone him to death." So the men of the city, the elders, the nobles who lived in the city, they did just as Jezebel had sent word to them, just as it was written in the letters that she had sent to them. They proclaimed a fast, they seated Naboth at the head of the assembly, the 2 scoundrels came in, they sat opposite him, and the scoundrels brought a charge against Naboth in the presence of the people, saying, "Naboth cursed God and the king." So they took him outside the city, and they stoned him to death. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, "Naboth has been stoned, he is dead." So with the mission accomplished, Jezebel tells her husband, Ahab, who's been sulking, to take, "No, now it's okay now, go take possession of the vineyard that you wanted so bad." So, villain assessment of Jezebel. So the author of Kings portrays Jezebel as a very strong-willed villain, willing to act ruthlessly. Nevertheless, she is very careful here to avoid having her husband seen as a simple tyrant. She doesn't just order Naboth to be killed by the soldiers and then they just take the land. Instead, she has a relatively clever ruse to have two people who are disreputable lie under oath and pretend that Naboth has committed this offense that he didn't, in order to have him executed and take control of his property. On the part about her loyalty to Baal and Asherah, it's portrayed as a negative from the biblical perspective, but it may actually indicate, her religious piety. Jezebel has a theophoric Baal name, so her name means something like, probably means anyway, where is the Lord? So Baal means Lord, in addition to usually referring to a particular god, Baal Hadad, but it could be any of the different lords. So Baal is part of her name, Jezebel, right? And that is also true for her father, as we talked about, Ethbaal or Ithobaal, and her brother, Baal Esser. And this is also true as Baal continues to be a great lord or great god for the Carthaginians. And so it's part of the theophoric name Hannibal, Hannibal being the great Carthaginian leader who confronted Rome. So even so that shows anyway that her dynasty, yes, is devoted to Baal. Nevertheless, there was also ongoing Baal worship among heroes of the Bible. So for example, in the book of Judges, one of the best leaders or judges is named Gideon, but Judges admits that Gideon also is known by a different name, Jerubbaal, and that's a Baal name. It means the Lord contends, but it also is, potentially reverencing Baal. And King Saul, who is the predecessor of King David of Judah, his son, whose name is disguised as Ishbosheth in the Bible, is actually a Baal name as well, Eshbaal, which means man of Baal. So there are, the Bible kind of shows us that, as we said in our Baal lecture, that Baal was reverenced more widely than it likes to give on. And so one of the things that seems clear is, despite the biblical portrayal of Israel, the northern kingdom, and Ahab as, portrayal of paganism as alien to the land, both they, the Israelites, and their neighbors share language, similar languages and customs. So Paleo-Hebrew writing is almost exactly the same as the famous Phoenician writing, of which Greek and all the others writing systems are descended from. So Phoenicians and Israelites, it seems from language and archaeology and so on, are part of a larger ethnic group of Canaanites that originally shared a polytheist Canaanite religion, and the Israelites differentiated themselves from it rather than being alien conquerors who came in according to, as portrayed in the biblical mythology. So although the Deuteronomists, who are the ones that are assembling these biblical histories, mytho-histories, they're writing under the patronage of the kings of Judah long after Israel's fall. And so although they like to portray the kings of the northern kingdom, the Omride kings, as enemies of Yahweh, it does seem like actually the Omride kings may have been the original promoters of Yahweh's cult. So even the focus on Baal may not indicate anti-Yahwehism, since Yahweh ultimately absorbed El and could have just as easily been identified in the northern kingdom with Baal. Later, his roles are absorbed in the later understanding of Yahweh, and Baal is seen as an enemy or a different god, pagan god. But as we see, El isn't. El is actually equated with Yahweh, And again, Asherah's roles are ultimately absorbed into Yahweh, the God of Israel. Baal could have been fully absorbed, including his name, which sort of just means Lord. They also call Yahweh Lord, just not using the word Baal. For example, another example of this is through the theophoric names of the northern kings. So, like again, although they are portrayed in the Bible as wicked opponents of Yahweh, many of the northern kings have theophoric names that aren't Baal names. They're actually Yahweh names. So, for example, Ahab and Jezebel's son, Jehoram, his name is Yahweh is exalted. So, far from again being an enemy of Yahweh, they're actually having a son that they're naming in Yahweh's honor. And the subsequent northern kings also have Yahweh theophorics, including Yehu, Jehoahaz, Jehoash, and Jeroboam. So in other words, all of these are showing that the northern kings are maybe actually concentrating on creating the cult of Yahweh, or Yahweh monolatry. And even the example of the northern kings setting up these golden calves, which are portrayed by the Bible as sort of the ultimate paganism, it's been suggested that the two calves that they are setting up at the shrines of Bethel, the house of God in the south, and at Dan, are actually meant to be not God, but mercy seats, essentially, for God, the God of Israel, to sit on and rest on in order to cover all of Israel with God's countenance. And of course, Baal rides on bulls, and so maybe this is suggesting that Baal and Yahweh are one and the same, and that Baal Yahweh is the God of Israel as understood by the northern kingdom. So it's a difference in understanding Yahwehism and the development of the Yahweh cult that doesn't get written that way in the actual Bible, which is antagonistic to the northern kings. And so, anyway, what we'll just say is, regardless of that kind of, some of that is speculative, some of that is surmise, and it may or may not be exactly the case. Nevertheless, what we can say is that Jezebel was not guilty of introducing paganism, since the Israelites were originally polytheists and followed Canaan's limited pantheon. Thus, Baal, and Asherah were already present, and so scapegoating Jezebel is kind of a mythic replacement of whatever the actual history was. As we're doing villains, let's hit one more of these. Another female villain from the Deuteronomic history, Delilah. The book of Judges describes this mythic period prior to the kingdoms of Israel and Judah developing, when Israelites lived as tribes who are governed by judges or chieftains. So in the course of the book of Judges, the judges only seem to get worse and worse and worse. And the last and worst of these is actually Samson, who has amazing superhuman strength, but that is paired with a lack of intelligence that is just as remarkable. So during the time period or the story of Samson, when it's set, the Philistines are in ascendance, and so this is a group that lives on the coast, in the area including Gaza, and they're seeking to conquer and keep the Israelites as a tributary people. However, in all of their attempts, they are thwarted by Samson, who, as I say, has superhuman strength and fighting ability, which is secretly related to his vows that he is a Nazirite. And so his mother had been barren, and she promised to give her child to God if she was able to have a child. And so that includes for him having sacred vows of abstaining from certain things, which includes abstaining from cutting his hair. So at a certain point, the Philistines become desperate to learn Samson's weakness. They wonder, okay, does he have like a vulnerable heel like Achilles does? How can we stop this guy? So Samson had married a Philistine woman, But despite that marriage, he continues to be a womanizer, and he visits prostitutes, for example. At a certain point, he begins an affair with Delilah, and the Philistines then see that as an opportunity. They bribe Delilah in order to learn the secret of Samson's superhuman strength. Unlike Jezebel, Delilah does not see any reason to come up with a clever plot in order to deceive Samson. You do not have to think 2 or 3 times or to try to outthink Samson. So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me what makes your strength so great and how you could be bound so that one could subdue you." So she has a very direct approach with this guy. So Samson says to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that are not dried out, then I shall become weak and be like anybody else." Then the lords of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that they had not dried out, and she bound him with them. And while men were lying in wait in an inner chamber, she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of fiber snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. And then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me, and you told me lies. Please tell me how you could be bound." This did not set off any alarm bells for Samson. So you'd think that he had just barely told her his weakness. She immediately does what that is and encourages all these Philistines to come in, and yet, again, he just goes right back to it. So he continues his affair with Delilah. She follows the same direct approach. He falls back on his same tactic 2 more times, first telling her that he has to be bound with fresh ropes. Then he says that she has to pin his hair up tightly in all of his locks up into a tight pin. Neither of those work either, but she does the same thing where she brings all these Philistines to test it. In both cases, the Philistines fail to capture him, and he still doesn't learn his lesson. So she says to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when your heart is not with me? You've mocked me 3 times now, and you've not told me what makes your strength so great." Finally, after she nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, he was tired to death. So he told her his whole secret. He said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me, and I would become weak like anyone else." So, of course, then Delilah, has sold out her lover, and they were able to capture Samson, and he becomes weak after he's had his hair cut. And in the very end, of course, he has his finale where he gets his strength back one last time and is able to push down the pillars of the great temple of the Philistines and kill all these Philistines in one foul episode. But not a bright hero. And anyway, like I say, Samson's a pretty big dummy, and so she may have reasoned that somebody else was going to figure out a way to get the secret out of him, because she didn't really trick him. She just simply kept on pestering him. So why shouldn't she get the 1,100 pieces of silver out of it? So Delilah, one of the villains of the Bible. So we've talked about a lot of these. We could not include every single one of them. Some of the villains, pretty obvious that we've left out, are people like Simon Magus from the New Testament, who the magician who wants to be able to buy the ability to perform all the different miracles that the disciples are doing in Jesus' name. The great hero of the Philistines, Goliath. David's son, vain son, beautiful son, Absalom, who rebels against his father. Another one of David's rebel sons, Amnon, who is the horrible crime of raping Tamar. There's littler villains, like in the story of Susanna from the expansions in Daniel, where 2 elders essentially, again, try to blackmail the maiden Susanna for sexual favors. And that also, similar story, but with the genders reversed, happens in the story of Joseph, where again, Joseph is a beautiful official in or servant in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. So those are just some of the examples of villains we didn't have time for, and you can maybe list off any of the other ones that are your favorites, and we'll end it there and I'll get another drink of water, and we'll let Leandro start collecting your questions, and we can continue the discussion. I want to thank people who've been supporting us through this whole lecture. So thanks to JM and Dave Anderson, to Dartha Rama, to James Dorn, to Ronan Ovstag, to Max Gonzalez, Dan Howard, Daryl Scott, Mark Long, David Foltz, Ron Wagner, Louis Tiemann, and Mark R. Mark R. says, some say God can use anyone when justifying actions. If a biblical author was ID'd and known to have taboo habits, like temple prostitute slaves, would this impact their reverence? Would that get them canceled? I'm not sure. No. I'm not sure if that's a question or if that's a comment. So yeah, I mean, we can see that so it's possible that when we're talking about God making use of Pharaoh in order to show the Israelites all of God's power, and that God alone freed them from captivity in Egypt, it may well be that he already knows that Pharaoh has a stubborn streak anyway, and so the phrase God hardened Pharaoh's heart that he would not let the people go is maybe just putting his finger on the scales a little bit. So like that. Okay. Do we have questions, Leandro?
Yes.
Okay, there are some questions. So Rain Weber says, can any evil person in the Bible be said to have power over God? For example, the king of Moab, who sacrificed his son to Chemosh to turn away the army of the Jews. So I don't think. So I guess I don't think that that's ultimate. It may be that. So it may be that there are components in the Bible which are reflecting like much older ideas, and so that there may be something in that case, like there is a something contractual about doing a ritual, and then maybe God is obliged. But ultimately, obviously, that theologically doesn't stand as the idea of God later evolves in the Bible. So in a way, whenever in earlier conceptions of God that exist in the Bible, whenever God is making like a covenant or a promise, whenever God is saying, the scepter shall never depart from the house of Judah, from the house of David, that's a promise that in theory all of the descendants of the house of David have as a power over God, but in practice that doesn't actually operate any more than the Deuteronomic idea of that you won't have troubles if you continue to just if you stop worshiping other gods, if you continue to obey all of God's commandments. And that's one of the things that we've seen at the biblical people understood over time. And that's why when we get to books like Job, people realize, no, you can obey God in every single way, and you can still face horrible suffering. So in some ways, the Bible claims that there would be power that you can have over God, but it doesn't actually work out that way, and that's certainly not how the theology evolved eventually. Jesus Tales says, Jeremiah called Nebuchadnezzar the Lord's servant and is taken care of by the royal guard. Was he treasonous in political terms? So depending on how you look at it. So yes. So part of the, but part of it was not. So our modern ideas of nationalism have changed how we understand, let's say, loyalty to a people and this kind of thing, loyalty to a nation. There was always courtiers in these ancient kingdoms and even medieval kingdoms, and even into modern times, where the courtiers will go and treat with the other courts, and it's not always considered anyway by the people to be treason, because they're at courtiers are actually usually operating at a different level from the regular people. There's a big division between it. So you can just think of a lot of different examples when a person is out of power, they go into exile in the enemy's camp, and eventually they're put back into power over their own people when, at the head of an enemy army or something like that. And this was happening very frequently, especially towards the end of the kingdom of Judah. Judah is just a tiny little kingdom, and so Nebuchadnezzar, as the head of the great Babylonian Empire, has much more power over who the officials are, and same thing, the Egyptians have a lot more power, and so the local nobles and prophets like Jeremiah are pushing for either they're pushing the court to either adopt a pro-Babylonian or a pro-Egyptian policy, and if you're, by calling an enemy or a foreign king the Lord's servant, I mean, we'd already just talked about that, how the Lord sometimes is said biblically to make use of foreign leaders in order to put Israel back on the right path. That's within the biblical worldview that happens. And so I don't know if Jeremiah is considered a traitor, therefore, by people in the Bible. K. Tempest Bradford says, do you think that the parallel between Esther and Herodias asking for John's head is intentional? And if so, do you have any thoughts on how important Esther was to early Christians? Curious because the Qumran community doesn't seem to have liked Esther's book because it's not in their library. And I've heard that too, and I actually said that in my review or my lecture on Qumran, on the Dead Sea Scroll community. But apparently now they have found fragments of Esther in that library, but that's some very recent findings. So almost everybody has said the other, including me in a lecture. I'm not sure. I feel like because that phrase is so similar, where he says, "I'll give you anything you ask," he says to a girl, "up to half my kingdom." I think that may well, I feel like the author of Mark here is familiar with that story in Esther, because it is a trope, and that happens more than just in that story of Esther, but it's such a specific boon where they both have the exact same boon. It does seem like that is probably the inspired source for that particular story. So I think that the parallel may be intentional, yes. I don't know how important Esther overall is to early Christians. It's an interesting story. It's more like a romance novel than a really important. It's not an apocalyptic story like the author of Mark might have been attracted to, but it is a fun action story. Gabriel Knight says, if Marcion thought of Yahweh as bad, would then Yahweh's antagonists then have been bad or good? Did Marcion or Gnostic belief systems leave room for cosmic villains other than the demiurge? So yes, there's all kinds of other villains other than the demiurge, because the demiurge goes on in this Gnostic cosmology, goes on to have a full negative, flawed creation. So in the same way that the true source of everything, the good God, the spiritual God, created, has emanations of all of the aeons, so too the demiurge creates all sorts of essentially the angels of Satan, the archons, the bad versions of that same thing. So there's other cosmic villains than just the demiurge. In terms of, this idea that if the Yahweh in Marcionite Christianity, if the God of the Old Testament is actually the demiurge, he's actually a villain, then are all of the enemies of that God, are they all actually good guys? I don't think that necessarily makes all of the enemies good guys, but it is one of those things that happen when you have this. One of the problems you have when you have this negative upside down worldview, it's like in Superman, the bizarro world, where everything can't be backwards in one way because things are not just one dimensional. So, okay, Donnie Lee Ringo in Brazil says, might there be a connection with the Christ figure of a good shepherd with Cain as a shepherd, David as a shepherd, and the nativity shepherds? So it's I think you mean Abel as a shepherd there. So Abel is the shepherd who is slain, and so therefore there's maybe an echo of Jesus there. David as a shepherd boy, there's an echo there, of course, that there is a connection there because Christ is envisioned as a son of David, right? And so when he comes into the temple, the children cry out, Hosanna to the Son of David. So he's a new David. And so yes, this imagery of Christ as a good shepherd is rooted in these biblical understandings of the kings as being shepherds, specifically David as a shepherd. Maybe also Abel, because Abel is innocent who's killed. And so that's an interesting connection. I don't know if there's a direct, not thinking if there's a direct parallel that shows up in the New Testament, but it's an interesting one. So Donnie Lee Ringo also asks, are there any records of 400 years of Hebrew slavery in Egyptian records, in the records of Pharaoh? No. So this is the Exodus. We have a great historical record in Egypt. The Exodus story is not historical, certainly not as described in Exodus in any way, where the majority of the population are Hebrew slaves that all have an Exodus. This is not something that happened as described. So people would like to take what is ultimately an origin story myth and find some kernel of historicity to it, that there had been somebody who was a slave at some point or other in Egypt who made their way there, and that's fine. But that's not the same as having the story having historicity. So the Exodus is one of the stories, like all the stories in Genesis, that don't have any historicity to them. They are mythic origins stories. Tyson says, was the serpent in Genesis understood as only a serpent in Jesus' time or as Satan? By Jesus' time, they have taken that story, which is very familiar to them, and they have understood the serpent to be Satan. So absolutely, they read it that way. So when I was saying that he's only a serpent, I'm saying that is what the original author intended, but everyone had already reinterpreted that by Jesus' time. K. Tempest Bradford says, I notice you chose villains based on the view of biblical authors. Are there also protagonists that you consider villainous? So, for example, K. Tempest Bradford says, I think Jacob is a villain for what he does to Esau. So yeah, I certainly didn't include Esau because I think poor Esau, I feel sorry for him. So even though Jacob is the protagonist of the story, he spends his time kind of cheating his brother out of stuff, and so yeah, that's one of the reasons why the Bible is actually much more interesting and nuanced than if it was a simple black and white narrative. And so some of these characters are very complex, and you wonder, well, wait a second, does this make them a villain? And so, this in the same example that you have here of Jacob and Esau, but if we go back to to David again. So David is this great hero in the sense of defeating Goliath as a boy and becoming the exemplar for the good kings of Israel, the good king of Judah, of the house of David. Nevertheless, he's absolutely villainous in terms of his killing of his soldier Uriah the Hittite in order to cover up an affair with and take his wife Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. And so, does that make David a villain? He's pretty villainous, in doing that. And so, yeah, there are characters who are heroes or the protagonists in the Bible who nevertheless do things that are morally questionable or clearly morally wrong. So is this, Leandro, is this your question? Or is this OF?
I say that OF says.
Oh, Leandro says, OF says, so acts are not evil, is intention evil? So Rain Weber says you can't do evil unless you have knowledge of it.
Now I say.
And now, OF says, I get it now. So OF says acts are not evil, is intention evil, and Rain Weber says you can't do evil unless you have knowledge of it. Then Leandro says Leviticus makes a difference between accidental and intentional killing. Do we read somewhere in the Bible a theological, mythological development of the idea of intentionality and free will in relation to evil and sin? So I think that when I was talking, for example, I was talking about free will, right? And when I was talking about Pharaoh, I say, how does Pharaoh have free will if God is hardening his heart? And so I think that that's anachronistic of me when I did that. And I, being anachronistic in a way on purpose, because I think that that when the author of that story is writing that story, they are simply not thinking at all of Pharaoh in terms of free will. So the idea of free will becomes much more important after the first temple period. So it becomes much more important in the second temple period. So the original, and you're talking about like the difference between intention and just doing stuff that's wrong. So in the first temple period, in let's say a non-reformed pagan society, or in just the original monolatry and henotheism, most everything that you're supposed to be doing initially is you're offering sacrifices in order to make it so that the gods can continue the operations of the world, keep the sun coming up and down, keep the rain flowing, and so on, and making all the machinery of the cosmos operate. And so there's really, in that kind of a universe, there's almost no difference between doing something wrong with a good intent or a bad intent at first. And that happens when you have, let's say, a more of your identity caught up in a tribal identity. Once we get into the classical time period, when people are starting to be much more concerned with the ancient idea of self, then they're way more worried about intentions and what's going to happen to them, rather than this kind of maintenance of doing rituals and things like that. And so we get that development, for example, in the prophetic tradition, like in Isaiah. So by especially the Deutero and Tertio Isaiah, the later additions to Isaiah are completely antagonistic to just doing rituals, to performing sacrifices and things like that. God says that he doesn't like them, he hates them. You're wasting your time if you don't have good intentions, if you aren't actually doing things that with the intention of actually helping the community. If you're just following the laundry list, that doesn't work. So I do think that in the course of the biblical period, there's a change from the one to the other. But I can't think of necessarily a time period when like God comes down and tells people that. It's just an insight that the prophets begin to have, and the other thinkers in the Bible begin to have, the sages, as the biblical period goes on. So Rain Weber says, how necessary are villains to the story of the Bible? Could God be good without evil to fight? So yeah, this is definitely a question that I think goes unasked often in the Bible, but it's something that theologians then have had to ask afterwards. And so people have asked, it's not in the story of Judas Iscariot, for example, is it necessary for Judas to have done that act? And if so, should he be damned for all eternity for that? As it sort of seems like the case of the biblical authors would have thought of it. And so there are reappraisals of what, of Judas' character or his role. And those actually occur in the next generations in some of the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal gospels, Gnostic gospels and so forth, that reevaluate what Judas was even doing. And that actually is an example, going back to the earlier question about the enemies doing the right thing. So maybe Judas was doing kind of the right thing according to the Gnostic gospels, because it was necessary. Similarly, in modern times, there's Protestant speculation that maybe it was necessary to get all of the dispensation, human history, going for Eve to partake of the fruit of the tree. So maybe she again shouldn't be blamed in any way for that, because without that, all of the reproduction couldn't have happened. There would never have been mortality. We would never have the whole world like this. And so, do you have to have evil in order to have good? So theologically, Augustine argues, for example, that evil isn't actually necessary, that evil is absence of good as opposed to it being its own equal and opposite force. And so, nevertheless, it would make the story a lot more boring if there were no villains. Josh Bedford asks finally here, what is my favorite Bible villain? I guess out of all the ones that I just went through, who do I like the best? I've just barely surveyed all of these characters, and I'm not sure which one of them I liked the best. I spent a lot of time on Jezebel because I think that she was interesting.
Pretty cool, yeah.
Yeah, and so maybe I'll say that, and I think it's because she has at least some complex motivations. So she and her dynasty actually are interested as portrayed. They're interested in these gods, and Elijah's a pretty aggressive antagonist to her religion. I'm going to have to end this pretty soon here because I keep coughing. And then also her plot is pretty sneaky. She has a really good plot compared to almost all these other ones. Like I say, Delilah's plot, she didn't have to spend a lot of time thinking of that in order to outwit Samson. So maybe I liked, out of all of these that I went through today, I liked Jezebel the best. So thanks so much. So we're going to, next week, as you know, keep the questions coming because we'll answer those. Leandro and I will be here for Let There Be Answers, episode number 2 next week. And then the week after that, we'll finally be able to explore
the Spirit.
The Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and we didn't do the poll here in the live chat because YouTube only allows us to do 5 villains, but we will send the question out. So keep an eye on it. Thanks, everyone.